Dr. Gordon took his bachelor's degree at Pomona College in California and then took both his master's degree and PhD from Purdue. His subject this evening is international slums. Dr. Gordon.
I think later you will regret your kindness, but I'll try not to let you down. Well, thank you, sir. The question at hand is international slums. I know that sounds rather melodramatic. One of the thoughts that occurred to me as I was contemplating these remarks was, well, what is my thesis, really? What am I saying? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized what I was really wanting to say, what my real goal was to scare you. In short, simply to raise hell. If there is a thesis, I would insist that it is that the situation in terms of urban development and urban growth, particularly in the so-called underdeveloped areas, is almost unspeakably bad, almost totally impossible. In fact, so much so that I begin to think that only by the tragic misfortune of what I call the atomic cure will we ever get out of it. I don't recommend that cure, though at times as I look at the data, it looks like the one, quote, positive hope. Now, this all started because in trying to get a better grasp of 19th century slum conditions for some lectures I was working on, I concluded that the only parallel to the world of Charles Dickens was probably the slums of a city such as Mexico City or Buenos Aires or wherever you wish to take. I also have the feeling that we don't really see it for what it is. Look, world population is increasing, as probably most of you know, at about 2% per annum. Our urban population, and I'm thinking mostly of the underdeveloped areas, tends to grow at about 4% per annum. Now, there is what I call, or what it was originally he called, Contini's law. When Signor Contini spoke here, he said, the bigger the mess, the greater the attraction. Well, this is true, because the larger urban areas in the underdeveloped parts of the world, your population is increasing at the rate of about 8% per annum. Now, if you'll play with that, 8% per annum means that your population doubles just about every 12 years. Now, that's wild. I'm sorry, that's just wild by any standards. It's wild even by California standards, where there is an economy that can support a very rapid growth, such as Haywood, California. Keep in mind also that in most of the world, again the underdeveloped world, half of your population is under 16 years of age. This we know is true of Africa. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination, I think, for the university student to think what happens around one's 16th birthday and thereafter. That is, one likes to think, well, they'll grow up and that will be it, but of course not. Even if without Playboy, they will get involved in all kinds of things, and if half your population today is under 16, think what they'll be up to in the next few years, and then this thing, of course, tends to have a snowballing effect. Well, you'll say, how about birth control? Indeed, it is at this point, our one hope. The discouraging thing in terms of birth control, though, is that even now, it is in effect almost too late. If every woman in an underdeveloped area were to start popping pills in her mouth or get lips as loop, you would still have a fantastic situation. And we know this isn't going to happen. We think at the best, at the quickest, it would be 30, maybe 40 years before the underdeveloped area really takes birth control seriously en masse. By then your population has perhaps doubled or quadrupled almost, certainly in your urban areas, almost quadrupled. Now, let me play with one example to give you some feel for it. I'm thinking of Calcutta. And by the way, Calcutta is just about the end of the world when it comes to our urban problems. In 1870, Calcutta had a population of 400,000, a little smaller than Indianapolis. In 1963, Calcutta has a population of 6.5 million. By the way, living on the streets of Calcutta, utterly bereft of shelter, are now about 400,000 people. That is, almost the population of Indianapolis lives on the streets. That is, again, note the population of 1870. By the way, this means, and think this through for a moment, they sleep on the streets without cover. They eat on the streets. They have their babies and mate on the streets. They do their toilet on the streets. And then ultimately, maybe if they're lucky enough, they get to die on the street. Well, that's what you've got. By the way, the system, the British instituted, and is still used by the Indian government, every morning in these districts where the majority of the population is without any housing whatsoever, a truck, a flatbed truck, rumbles down the street at walking speed, and on each sidewalk there walks an attendant, and he goes along, and of course it's at dusk, morning dusk. He kicks the people who are sleeping, like they do in the hospital every morning at 4:30 when they stir your bones. Well, he kicks them, and if they don't stir, he kicks them again. And if they still don't stir, he waves to two other fellows who come and pick them up and throw the body on the flatbed of the truck, and away he goes to be buried. And that's the way that goes. And you have a great deal of this, of course. Well, if it is that today in India, and by the way, their water situation is absolutely gruesome in Calcutta. They're in a delta area, and it's very, very bad. The majority of the population is now consuming some very, very impure water every day, that is utterly unfiltered water. If it's been filtered, it's been filtered from upstream of the Ganges through umpteen villages and hamlets and towns, and the filtering process there is not what you and I call filtering, it's the antithesis. So the dangers of disease are absolutely staggering. In fact, intestinal dysentery is almost endemic in Calcutta among the poor, and the majority are the poor, of course. And by the way, how productive are you when you've had intestinal dysentery? How well do you work? I remember Montezuma's revenge for 3 days, and it kind of wipes one out. And yet here, this is a condition prevalent. Now, when you look ahead, our best projection figures, and they're always a bit tricky, for 1986, the year 1986 is 11.2 million people in the Calcutta urban area. That is a doubling of the present population. There will simply, as we see it now, be totally inadequate facilities. If it's bad now, we simply cannot envision an adequate increase in facilities in the meantime. And in the year 2000, Kingsley Davis has worked on it. He has a minimum figure of 20 million in the Calcutta urban area and a maximum figure of 66 million. Now, we were all very leery of his figure of 66 million. It seemed rather extreme by any standards. This figure was devised about 1961, I believe. A very recent report that I see from India indicates that the actual, probably a better guess for the population of the Calcutta urban region in the year 2000 will be around 64 million. So there you are. By the way, 2000, for those of you who are young, seems very, very far away. It seems like the other end of life. I assure you it's, 34 years away, and those years will begin to come up very, very fast. Now, not only do you have this problem in Calcutta, you have it really on the base of rural poverty. That is, you don't have an affluent rural backdrop with which to support it. You're utterly devoid of any adequate backdrop. Take another example, Recife, Brazil. By the way, Brazil will be, we think, about 3/5 urban by 1970. It's very rapidly, Brazil is becoming an urban nation. Again, though, we find the peculiar situation that we find in Calcutta. There is not an urban economy available. That is, you have an urban populace without an urban economy. That is, without an adequate industrial base. We theoretically thought this could never and would never happen, but it now seems to be happening most every place. Recife, in 1957, had a population of 450,000. In 1962, that is 5 years later, she had a population of 900,000. Now, the breakdown of this population, by the way, indicates that half of the growth, roughly, now this is very rough, half of the growth is internal migration, that is, people coming to the city. You can't keep them down on the farms in the northeast areas, and for very understandable reasons. They starve there, and they'd rather starve in Recife. The other half of the population increase tends to be, though I think this is a little overestimated in this figure, tends to be internally generated. You have a very fertile population, essentially, of course, young people, and young people tend to be very fertile turtles. Not only that, the growth in a 5-year period, a doubling of the population, seems to be accelerating since 1962. I don't have the most recent figure. The figure, in fact, I don't even have a figure, but 1964, data seem to indicate that the population growth was not only continuing but accelerating. Again, you wonder where this leads you. Well, I can tell you it leads to two things in Recife. We have some data that tells you what the city government has done and what the affluent people of the community have done. Well, the city government has given up doing anything. That is, they simply don't do anything about the problem. Why? They say, well, look, there are no votes in it. The poor peasants who come to Recife are not voting residents. Consequently, having no vote, there is no political gain for the ruling clique of Recife to do anything. And so they said. Not only are they sitting in this direction, there's an even deeper problem in Brazil, and one that's not atypical in many underdeveloped areas. There is stagnation at the level of the central government. That is, Brasilia may have the last of Le Corbusier's dream, but they don't have an effective government at this point, except to put down university students when they riot. So you see stagnation through the entire political structure. This has, I think, very severe political implications when you think of the issue of traditional communist appeals. Now, what are the affluent people doing? Obviously, what the affluent should do, they should recognize the dilemma and should get out there, if not with Christmas baskets, at least do something and somehow push some kind of urban program. Well, they're not. And when you think about it, you'll see why they're not, and you can hardly blame them, though it doesn't help things. Actually, we find the affluent of Recife are becoming what one might say hard and hardened. That is, they are withdrawing any sympathy and empathy they had for the poor. It reminds you, by the way, a little bit of the British in the Republic of South Africa, who've steadily pulled back, you might say, some kind of ultimate backlash. Well, here again, you have a group that's pulling back, and instead of trying to do anything about the problems of the poor in Recife, they are putting up bigger and better iron grating on their windows and bigger and better barbed wire fences at the periphery of their gardens. Now, look, this seems selfish to you and to me. It seems not only selfish, it seems, I think, rather short-sighted. But if you think about it a moment, it's very reasonable. Look, you're not going to solve the problem with a limited upper and upper middle class in Recife. Things are getting worse. Things are becoming politically tense. It's very understandable that a group in the society assumes a defensive posture. But ultimately, of course, this probably is going to be rather disastrous. Unfortunately, the press of Recife, which reflects both the views of the community government, the city government, and the wealthy classes, is again and again accusing the communists of fomenting the peasants who come to Recife to live. Well, obviously the communists are interested in fomenting what they can, but it's more vicious than that, because you see, If the newspaper tells you the communists are the only ones who are standing up for the poor of Recife, and you are yourself of the poor of Recife, where do you turn then for political leadership? You see, you're kind of feeding the thing. You're actually building the image by throwing mud when you look at it from the perspective of the poor. The poor themselves can say, even the Recife Daily News or the Recife Evening Press or the Recife Star tells us that it is the communists who are behind our agitation. You see, this is disastrous. Well, where's it going to go? I don't think we really know. Well, let me pick another example now from the Far East. I want to pick two examples from Hong Kong. And by the way, this is very typical. The situation in this one ghetto I want to mention, the Cam Tin Ghetto, in case you're interested, K-A-M-T-I-N, the Cam Tin Ghetto. The Cam Tin Ghetto is very typical of how the poor live anywhere in the world. And I, by the way, subscribe to Oscar Lewis's thesis that the culture of poverty is an international culture. Let me review that for those of you who are unaware of that argument. Oscar Lewis, on the basis of his work, he's an anthropologist, has concluded that we really have a culture of poverty, that grinding economic poverty generates certain communalities, certain uniformities, certain similarities anywhere in the world. That is, you would say then that the poor of Recife have more in common with the poor of Hong Kong and would understand each other, share a culture in a loose sense of the term, more than either of them share with the middle classes of Hong Kong or of Recife. You might again say, though the American situation is somewhat unique in many ways, and I would be cautious here, you might say the poorest people of Harlem have more in common with the Sanchez family of Mexico City than they have with the fellow going to his office in New York wearing a white collar. Now, the Cam Tin Ghetto is a 1-acre site. It's really an old medieval village dating from about 1300 A.D. in the new territories of the Hong Kong area. It's 1 acre in dimension, and it has one narrow gate entering to it. You have one narrow gate. By the way, I understand an acre is about half a large city block. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I did not grow up near farmland, and I show a painful lack of knowledge about these things. About a half a big city block. There is one gate, and the gate is about 48 inches wide. There is a moat around it. It was a walled, fortified city. The moat today is not the beautiful thing it was, presumably in 1300 A.D. It's kind of a muddy, little, dribbly, seaweed or whatever you call it, moss-filled, stagnant area with a few rather pitiful ducks that crawl around in it, and I'm sure rodents make quite a time of it and so forth. Within the ghetto, within this compound, this walled compound, you have one spring with, by the way, one water bucket and 2 small water towers. And that's it. That's your water supply. Now, how many people live in the Cam Tin Ghetto? A half a city block. By the way, it is not high-rise. There are no 2-story constructions. In fact, most of it is open without any roofing. You have walls but no roofing. How many could one fit into such an area? Would a figure of 500 be a reasonable maximum? Too small? Or would you settle for 1,000? Too small? He's gunning for me. Now, look, you've got a half a city block and you don't have a 40-story building. Would you settle for 2,500? Say yes, please, or you ruin me. All right, what you have, of course, because I set you up for it, is 5,000 people. Now, someone who's good with mathematics, why don't you figure it out and let us know? I'm terrible at mathematics, as my wife will concur. How many square feet per capita have you got in an acre with 5,000 people? Would anyone work it out on the side? Oh, yep. 80 square feet per capita. I beg your pardon? That's 9 by 9. Yeah. Wait, 9 square feet? That's 3 by 3. Well, I'll take your word. I won't argue the mathematics. I'll settle for the result like a crass human being. All right. Yeah, all right. 3 by 3, that's all yours. By the way, notice you have to subtract. You have to subtract from this the land area taken up by the walls of the exterior. Yeah. And also the walls within it, because you do have individual dwelling units. And each one, of course, has its little walls. You also have to subtract the area taken for streets. By the way, the only way it works, frankly, is that the men are gone most of the day. Actually, you're using the canteen ghetto in shifts. These 5,000 people apparently handle it somewhat in shifts. By the way, I kept thinking, what do you do in terms of bringing food in through one narrow gate for 5,000 people? Now, again, let's assume half the meals are taken outside of the ghetto. But how do you handle the food? How do you handle the waste deposits? Well, I can tell you how they handle the waste, and I hope you didn't have a snack recently. They have one toilet facility. Apparently it is a flush toilet, which is a curious thing, because a very good friend of ours, in fact a relative, went through the Camden ghetto, and she tells us that when they opened the door to the toilet for these 5,000 people, even if half of them use something else half the time, well, you could just barely see the toilet. And the flies, of course, were wild, and you saw this great pile of human waste, to put it politely. And she closed the door and tiptoed away, rather sickened by the encounter. Again, I wonder what the point was having a flush toilet. Someone must have had a utopian dream. Well, now let's mention the streets. The main drag, Walnut Street. Now, Walnut's not very wide, I grant you, but the main drag of the Camden ghetto is 36 inches wide. That's 3-foot street. That's as wide as our wide house inner door. No, your front door is often a 36-inch door, I believe. By the way, the side streets, the side alleys that go down to the individual dwelling units, the average street width is 21 inches. That means most of us who are big, clumsy Caucasians would have to go down sideways, and if you have claustrophobic tendencies, I think you're in real trouble. Can you see getting the fire department in there? Now, the actual dwelling units, and by the way, these dwelling units are very typical. Your exterior dimensions are 10 feet by 20 feet. You have a wooden door, and it's a mud brick walling, no windows, but an open ceiling. Your room, and this seems again very typical in many parts of the world in terms of slums, your 10 by 20 area is really broken down into what you could call 3 rooms. There's the front sitting room. Now these are euphemisms I trust you recognize. The front sitting room. The center area tends to be the kitchen. And the kitchen has, if there's any roofing on anything, and by the way, Hong Kong has very heavy monsoon rains, tends to be some boards or tin plate, probably old Coca-Cola signs that Pepsi's written down, some tin plate that covers part of the kitchen area and on which you dry your fruit. You know, the Chinese love to pickle everything, literally, and they will pickle fruit up here in the sun. Then you have the bedroom behind it. That's an area 10 by 20. I suspect if you think of this 10 by 20, it's just a little tiny area right here. Now, what is your average occupancy per dwelling unit? Well, between 7 and 15 people. Now, look, You get to the point you say, this is utterly inhuman. This is an inhuman situation. Well, it is, but it happens to be the way they live. This is not atypical of many ghettos in many parts of the world. By the way, there's one bathhouse also. I don't know what they get done with it, but they have a bathhouse. Let me read you an account by the same traveler of another ghetto that is more bizarre and, I believe, less typical. Yes?
This gate was 48 inches wide. This is the only access into this ghetto and egress.
Yes, you're correct. It's more than, actually, as I think about it, I've seen photographs of it. And by the way, the gate itself has an interesting history, I understand. I think the gate is more like 5 feet. But are we going to have trouble getting them in and out?
Well, slightly. This is why I want to know, well, why don't they do something backwards and stop a hole in the wall or something so that
My first thought is, well, let's see if the Junior Chamber of Commerce can help, but not all the world works on the JC principles, which I frankly consider something of a blessing in many ways. Oh, I can't help but tease. Please, I can tease my own sentiments equally brutally, I suspect. Oh, yes, I can say very nasty things about Mr. Schlesinger, Jr. That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think it's probably a rather complicated answer to do with tradition, habit, also cultures that in some ways, though this is very glib and I don't think it's an adequate answer by any means, sir. I suspect we are a culture that's rather strongly committed to change and to innovation. This is not typical of most cultures. Beyond that, I'm sure there are other aspects, more pragmatic aspects. Perhaps it's against the city ordinance of the Camtin village, dating from the year 1437 when the Emperor Huang was sitting there, you know. It could be pretty wild, but I obviously don't have an answer for your question. You know, sir, I quite agree with you. From our point of view, of course it's insane. The trouble is, if I could just say, well, this is the Camtin ghetto and it's somehow unusual. It isn't, though. One thinks of Oscar Lewis's discussion of the Sanchez's world, and by the way, the Sanchez family did not live in the worst slum area of Mexico City. It was equally bad in some regards, and again, quote, nothing is done about it. I know Professor Weiss is here. Perhaps later when we open it up for full discussion, he's a cultural anthropologist. I know I saw him here a while ago in a red sweater. Perhaps he can pick up this a little bit and help us. I feel out of my depth, frankly. Well, let me mention the other, another ghetto. And this is, let me read you from the account. It's a traveler's account, a very acute observer, by the way. I have a high regard for the observational acuity of the observer. Quote, "We changed into our most disreputable dresses. We removed all jewelry and makeup." Again, this is in Hong Kong. "We tied scarves around our heads and set out to what is called the Sunken Village. It is about 10 or 12 acres. That's about 6 city blocks. And it is completely underground, and therefore it is called the Sunken Village. It is controlled by Communist China, even though it is in the Hong Kong area. That is, you see, Hong Kong is a British enclave on the face of Red China. Then within that enclave, apparently you've got an inner enclave. I know this gets rather introspective. You've got an inner enclave, this underground basement, you might call it a 6 city block basement area that's controlled by the Red Chinese. It is controlled by Communist China, and no British officers are permitted in its confines. No officers of any sort, health or military. Our chauffeur stopped a block above this rat hole," that is a value judgment, by the way, "above this rat hole, and we walked down to one," and here again, sir, to your point, "and we walked down to one of the 3 entrances. The entrance was not more than 24 inches wide." Again, 6 city blocks, 3 entrances, 24 inches wide, and there the ghetto began. No light, only shadows broke through in spots. Steps in mud and stone with little gutters running absolutely foul with excrement and seepage. Little side streets about 18 or 20 inches wide. Only the thin Chinese could go in these alleyways. And there in the depths were knitting mills. Ceilings less than 5 feet high, and the machines whirling away at rag-like rugs. And unbleached muslins and mosquito netting were being made. The air was absolutely foul, and only 1 or 2 dim light globes in the factories. Dirt floors and human beings squatting around like animals. Match factories, where very little children sat shaving matches from softwood sticks and packing little boxes. They were also trimming rubber heels, making rattan stools, only small ones because larger ones cannot be carried out through the door. Opium smokers, no fakes. A nightmare, and only one who had been there and guided could ever find his way out of it again. These thousands of people live and die in this place, and some never venture out of it. I saw 18 or 20 people, old and young, and babies, living in a mud-walled room with only 1 door, of course no windows, just squatting and lying around with no furniture to speak of. Only 1 old bench-like table on which lay a sick child, pale as a ghost and thin and naked. An old grandfather sat fanning the child with an old palm-leaf fan. Evidences of hemorrhages on the steps, a goose tied under a half-broken chair, and a huge dog watching a factory. Thieving is rampant. When I say a factory, I don't mean a factory. I mean a larger hole in the midst of this debris. And what did I hear but the Swan of Turanella being played through the tiny tin pan radio? And this was to help the carders and the wool winders work on and on. On one child, covered with sores and debris, a beautiful, solid jade bracelet. We were grateful to pass joss sticks burning before a papier-mâché shrine. At least it relieved the nostrils of stench for a moment. An old man sat just looking at us, a tumor as big as an orange bursting from his eye. Out of this subhuman rat hole, we emerged along a passageway so dark I had to be led by one of the missionary boys who had been there before to give help to one of his converts. And right next to the ghetto, above ground, the British are tearing down disreputable slums. But by the way, they are luxurious compared with the sunken village. And there they are putting up block housing where 4,000 people will live in one apartment house, but there will be flush toilets, 1 on each floor. I worked that out, 1 toilet for every 660 people. Again, I wonder if the flush toilet's the route to go. Now, let me mention, while we're talking about Hong Kong, let me mention here what they are doing. A third of the population still sleeps 6 to a bed. A third of the population sleeping 6 to the bed in Hong Kong. By the way, not too many years ago, my wife and I saw a charming little film about come to see Hong Kong, beautiful Hong Kong. You know, Susie Wong does have a heart of gold and all that. Well, I must tell you that 1 out of 10 people in Hong Kong sleep on the streets. 1 out of 3 sleep 6 to a bed or more, and I don't know how you can get more on a bed. And 1 out of 4 suffer from either TB or malaria. Again, think of the productive capacity of people suffering from either tuberculosis or from malaria. Now, the new housing is rather impressive. They are planning on about 2,000 people per acre. That's the density they hope to achieve. Compare these figures, by the way. In suburbia, I understand that our average density is about 5 to 7 people per acre in our, middle-class suburbia. Here you have 2,000 people per acre. Our most dense urban renewal projects, I understand, have about 275 people per acre, our most dense. I believe Harlem at this point has around oh, I'm sorry, I think it's around 300 and something per acre, but I may be wrong on that figure. This is comparative figure. By the way, some of these apartment complexes are going to hold a total of 43,000 people, one apartment complex. That is virtually the population of Anderson sewed up in one apartment complex, which tells you something about Anderson and the world. Two of them will take care of Muncie, in case you're a chauvinist for our town. By the way, this means that you will have 120 square feet per person, hopefully. This is their goal. That's, by the way, the average professor's office, unless he's in a hall closet, has about 120 square feet. That's what, about 11 by 12. They will have baths, and they are thinking of that's 120 square feet per household. That's a professor's office per household. They are hoping to achieve roughly, their ultimate goal, 32 square feet per person. That's 4 by 6, 4 by 8. 4 by 8, right, 4 by 8. That's about the width of this, I suspect one half of this platform is about 4 by 8 per person. That's your own little world. Now, this is their goal. Remember, this is where they hope to go. By the way, there's a surprising thing that might amuse you about the Hong Kong effort. These apartments are 6 to 9 stories tall. Of course, they're walk-ups. There are no elevators. And to everyone's surprise, particularly the British, the top-story apartments were the first to go, first to be taken up. Can you imagine hiking up 9 floors? You don't have to keep your youthful figure that badly. Why were they first to go? Well, they tried to think about it a number of ways. They wondered, well, is it because of ventilation? Is it because of traditional culture, in Chinese culture? Is there, something we don't? No. You know what it was? Status. They have acquired the Western concept of the penthouse, and the higher your floor, the higher your status. They don't have Otis elevators, though. You need Otis to have this kind of game work. Now, there's one more point I want to make before I sum up, and that is one thing we had all anticipated, and we have all been wrong, and we were terribly ethnocentric, that is, terribly culturally self-centered. We had thought that with urbanization comes a change in social character. That is, we thought that urban people change their habits and their way, that urbanism is a way of life. This, by the way, this thought is an old one in Western intellectual circles. It was furthered by the work of Louis Wirth in the 1920s, an eminent sociologist. But unfortunately, Louis Wirth and the historians and others who talked about this were only thinking of the Western world. We now find, particularly again, our data comes from Calcutta, that end-all of slums, and we find this. We assumed first, as I mentioned earlier, that you would have an industrial base. Otherwise, there's no point in going to the city. Well, that's wrong. Urbanism can occur without an industrial base. People apparently would rather starve in the city than starve on the farms. And you can starve very adequately both ways. Second, we had presumed that you would have the formation of nuclear families. That is, instead of the extended family, with all the cousins, sisters, and aunts, you would simply have the small, intimate family of mother, father, children, and maybe grandparents. Well, that doesn't work out. In the Calcutta area, you find the extended family pattern continuing in full force. By the way, we find it actually continues in the Western world more than we'd realized. We had presumed that people would become cosmopolitan. By cosmopolitan, we implied a kind of sense of relativism, a kind of sense of standing outside their own culture and looking into it. That is, a kind of ability to stand outside their own world and look in upon it as outsiders. Well, they don't. They're just as provincial, if you wish, as ever. We had presumed that there would certainly be a breakup of the caste system in India. That is, the old system of social stratification simply can't work in a modern factory or in a modern city. How do you avoid body contact or shadow contact? You know, this is an issue in India where your shadow cannot touch a shadow, let's say, of a Brahmin. How can you do this, on the streets of Calcutta any more than on 42nd Avenue? Well, apparently the caste system continues in all its ramifications. We had presumed that they would secularize, that is, that they would give up traditional religion. Some of you would consider this good, some of you would consider it bad, particularly if you're Hindu. Well, no. Traditional religion goes on just about as always. We had a thought that they would become more sympathetic to rapid social change, that cosmopolitans, one aspect, I guess, of cosmopolitanism is a sensitivity and a desire to see social change, that change in and of itself is desirable. By the way, Detroit every fall hinges the fate of the economy on that little game. But it seems that they are not. They are just as resistant to change, both in custom and in material culture, as they were on the farm. Finally, and most important, of course, we had presumed that there would be, rather shortly after coming to the urban area, within 5-10 years after coming to the urban area, a rather sharp decline in birth rates. That this was certainly the pattern of the Western world. People came to the city, they continued to have large number of children, the poor, but within 10 years, most of them began to put at least some of their economic energies into the acquisition of material goods and began to practice birth control. Even in the 19th century, even the Irish in America did this without our modern birth control devices. That they wanted to give their children fewer children a higher standard of living and more opportunity rather than have more children. Well, this pattern simply does not apply, we now recognize, in the Far East, and we suspect it does not apply in much of Latin America, and we yet don't know about Africa. So in short, everything we had counted on, everything we had hoped for, in the way of the indirect impact of urbanization upon people, seems not to apply in the underdeveloped areas, at least not today. Now, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us, of course, in a roaring mess. I think, and this is why I want to scare you and raise hell with you, if some of you are going into city planning and into architecture, I trust you have now come to the point that you know the house beautiful in the city terrible is no longer adequate, though Muncie continues boldly along this dated pattern, as does much of America. Rather, I suspect that some of you, the more far-seeing architectural and planning students, and I gather the majority of you are that, are thinking in terms of something like the Reston experiment, about new towns, only new towns that are more vivacious than the average British new town. New towns on the order of Reston, or maybe the new Cumbernauld experiment outside of Glasgow. Some of the work being done in France is very impressive. Look, that's fine. I'm all for it. And believe me, I think it will be an improvement on spreading what Peter Blake called God's own junkyard that we're doing in our country and in this part of the nation. I think that's fine. I think that's great for America. But if you look at the data of world urban population, and you look at the UN data, and the UN has now very good data, you are living in a rich man's fool's paradise. If you are going to be concerned beyond the borders of that 20% of the world, mostly Western, that is affluent and practicing a great deal of birth control, and we'll throw in Japan, you simply aren't being told that Reston isn't going to touch it. You must think in much, much more radical terms. Much more radical terms. I think the one group that's impressed me in this regard for its boldness is the Japanese group. I mentioned to my own class the metabolism group. They call themselves the metabolism group, and this term has much significance. They are really thinking in large-scale terms. That is, how are you going to handle this kind of urban population boom? And I think their work is very brilliant, very interesting, and not as utopian as I had initially anticipated. At first I thought that much of their work would be, Corbusier's drawing in 1922 with a beautiful ink pen, heaven on earth, but never did a traffic flow count, and that kind of thing. No, they're much more hard-headed than that, and they simply say that truly they're the only ones who are looking at the future with any kind of realism. Well, I hope this is a perspective that you will begin to think about, but I'm afraid that about when we finally get around to getting away from our traditional suburbia and move along the direction of Reston or Cumbernauld, about when we get there, the world will find that totally out of date, and we will have to think along the avenues of such as metabolism. Well, look, I've rather giving you a blood and thunder or hell and damnation or fire and damnation or something. Why don't we throw it open to questions and thises and that's, and let's play with it and see where we go. Yes, sir? You're thinking of, I believe, sir, a charmingly Malthusian control. Let me give you the information that I have on that. We now suspect that and this is pretty good data, but let me caution you against my own remarks to this extent. This kind of long-range extrapolation is very tricky. You can get very far off, and later you look back and you blush. But at least the best we can look dimly into the future at the moment, we think actually, and this work, by the way, comes out of the University of Chicago, that the Earth can probably feed fairly adequately about 50 billion people. That is, we can hold a world population of between 25 and 50 billion. Remember, it will be about 6 billion in the next 34 years. So we can handle them in terms of diet. What it means, of course, as one French poet described the situation in Algeria, he said, what you're really going to have in Algeria, that was his example, he said you're going to have the fallaheen, the peasants, squatting row upon row in the desert, knee to knee, one, standing, squatting over the rocky sand. And they will be eating algae cakes, they make sea rations look good, I guess. They'll be eating algae cakes and defecating into the sand. We can feed 50 billion. But who the hell wants to live like that, frankly? By the way, we even now recognize that we cannot, at this point, we do not think much of the underdeveloped area, particularly Asia, can ever achieve a Western standard of living, unless there are enormous technological changes. That is, the Chinese will never be able to have steak dinner at the Flamingo Friday night. They just never will. I know that isn't the end of the world, but some of you think it is. But it's not bad. But look, the land area you would need for cattle grazing alone makes that an absurdity. You see, this is the kind of thing you're writing against. We can feed them, but what style of life, what quality of life? And even now, our quality of life is barred to much of the world. By the way, if you think of migration, I must wipe you out right there on that. If India were to export 1 million people a year to Australia, it wouldn't do any good. No, 1 million people a month. 1 million people a month. You have Boeing 747s airlifting, If you export a million a month, all you do is hold the population of India constant, because they're increasing at about 12 million a year. By the way, what then have you done to Australia? And I keep wondering, what do they do in the back of the airplane while they're flying? Well, they have babies. No, it's terribly discouraging. Yes, sir. Figures are pretty tricky, and it's kind of a dangerous thing to argue. We say, India, let's say, overall, 37-year. But this isn't quite representative, because what you have, of course, is a very high infant mortality rate, which warps your data, your average very quickly. To use the classical average, the mean, is not a good measure for this. By the way, we had thought for a long time that, well, that means that if you get through your first 10 years, you can presume to live to a ripe old age. This now does not seem to be the case. Granted, your biggest chance of loss is in the first 10 years, which of course is very wasteful for the economy. If you'll think it through in terms of economics, it's very wasteful. Better not to have the child than have him die at the age of 7. But it turns out that even if you get through the first 10 years, it's not unlikely that you'll die in your mid-50s, which to me now doesn't seem so far away. You see. Yeah.
You justify fluoridation in countries like this, and in that case,
radioactive compounds. Now, I trust those of you who laugh out of amusement. I'm afraid some of you clap out of some kind of political negativism, which, to say the very least, I do not share. I think I could agree with you this far, though, those of you who wish to critique the usual liberal posture of which I am a member, and that is that in many cases probably we are simply throwing good money after bad. Remember, there's this crazy irony in India that we are supplying 1/5 of India's wheat needs. That's 2 freighters a day go to India, straight open aid. We are supplying 1/5 of India's wheat needs, which is marvelous. The trouble is the rats of India are destroying about 1/5 of India's own grain crop, which means we are feeding the rats of India. That's all we're doing. We're keeping the rats nourished. We're even contributing, therefore, to the rat explosion. Now, the trouble, of course, why I can't really support that kind of critique is because if we weren't, the rats would still be eating 1/5, and then what happens to the Indians? Well, the rats start eating the Indians. And as a humanist, I cannot agree to that for a moment. Often our foreign aid efforts are a holding operation. Often they're not even that. Sometimes it's been suggested that we should concentrate, let's say, on Brazil for the Alliance for Progress and ignore the rest of Latin America, that the $20 billion in 10 years would just about set Brazil up if we're lucky. The trouble is, in the meantime, Argentina can go to hell in a handbasket, and one always thinks of Castro, and that really shakes them up, you know. So you can't do that either. So you spread yourself around, and you get into trouble there. Also, the question comes up, do you want to send wheat to India and keep them from starving, or do you want to send capital goods and capital investment, which in the end will have a higher payoff effect? Let's say, rather than send wheat, why not send chemical fertilizer plants and machine tools that make chemical fertilizer plants? Go even one step further behind economically. The trouble is, in the meantime, what are the Indians going to eat? So you've got to send both. So there you are again. And then you fight a war in South Vietnam to the tune of $20 billion a year, and you think you live in some kind of a psychedelic world. Mr. Hannaford?
When economists make computations that dollars depend on birth control, education, and technique, is the productive is $300, and the most productive way $300 is otherwise.
You know what I think we have to develop, John? You know, we're spraying the fields of South Vietnam with weed killers. I think we've got to work out some very shrewd dust that's a birth control dust and fly over Calcutta, you know. By the way, the reluctance to practice birth control has many sources, among which, of course, that in these cultures, to have male heirs, women are, you know, they're crumbs anyway, to have male heirs is somehow to prove your masculinity. Apparently you have a stronger semen if you have sons than if you have women, if you have daughters. All right, you have male heirs. It's the great pride. And in areas that lack social security, a plethora of children are your best hope in terms of old age security, even though ultimately it's disastrous. There is ignorance often. There are, by the way, lack of number concepts. You get these hilarious situations where you give the women the beads and they laugh at you and say, you know, beads, and they can chalk them off, you know, what days of the month, and they laugh and they say, oh, you must know, you are Westerner, you know that beads don't make them stop babies, people make them stop babies. Well, you obviously didn't get the message across, you know. And beyond that, there are other factors. Also, in cultures that have so little in the way of either recreation or solace to the individual, eroticism, of course, can be a great comfort or pastime, and so forth and so on. And particularly, I think, in Latin American cultures where erotic prowess is directly correlated with masculinity, you have a real tough time in terms of this culture. Professor Reese? Professor Weiss, well, sir, I think your cure then is equally barbaric to mine, and I, of course, presume neither of us accept either one. I would hate to see Malthusian principles reenacted. I tell you, from a very short-range political point of view, I would be uneasy. I think next time China faces major famine, I would question her docility internationally. You see, this is where out of just sheer self-interest, nations that now can make major war, the very difference is itself a threat, and that they could exploit it. By the way, in this regard, I think one thing we have to remember, it was we in the West who gave, to some extent, the world, and again, it perhaps is both the blessing and the curse of our own arrogance and ethnocentrism, the idea of affluence for the general populace, the idea of the dignity of the individual. Western humanism is fairly Western. Now the American Indian had it, and we lacked it when we took care of the American Indian, But generally, we have been the ones who pervade the idea of prosperity and individualism, autonomy, and now they have bought our doctrine, and they find that the conditions of reality don't allow them to enjoy it. One might almost say, by the way, in one sense, another problem has been, of course, Western medicine. Chlorine in the water was the original mischief maker. That's worse than Adam and Eve almost. Am I talking any kind of sense to an anthropologist, or am I way? I'm trying to scare the hell out of them. Professor, you seem to be suggesting that not all the world wants blue or green Mustangs. A thought that would frighten the Ford Motor people, I think. Look, why don't we take one or two more questions then? I think officially we better terminate it, and if people want to stay around a while and kick things around, I'd be happy to. You could just come forward and we can boot things around, but I think one or two more questions we better officially ring down the curtain on, something for which obviously I have suggested no answers. I do not take my anti-humanistic jokes seriously any more than Professor Weiss does. So where do we go? What do we do? And in terms of city planning and architecture, what do you people do? Yes, sir. Oh, they're very good if he'll just come to Ball State and take night courses. But he doesn't. No, let me refer to you more seriously. Oscar Lewis points out, and I think he's on very good grounds, that if you want to get out of the culture of poverty, you have to do two things, and both these offend not only traditional American middle-class culture, they also contradict most traditional cultures. You must abandon your family. You must let your kin down, because until you abandon your kin, every time you have 5 pesos in your pocket, where you can begin to get rolling, somebody, auntie somebody, gets sick, and there go your 5 pesos. That is, they will keep you bogged down in the culture of poverty unless you have to betray them in order to help them later. And of course, morally, this is very offensive in the form that most children are reared in most cultures. Secondly, you must go into the world of crime. Yeah, you have to go into the underworld. Your chances of making it in the upper world, out of the culture of poverty, is almost, that is, you better go Susie Wong's route. Yeah, because you're not going to make it as a square. Well, you can, but well, I tell you, one person who did, and he's a fantastic exception, of course, is Claude Brown, My students are reading Man-Child in the Promised Land, but really he is so exceptional it's ridiculous. So this requires two violations of very fundamental things. But I want to say, that's the way it is. Again, I guess my purpose has been shock value, and yes, sir. You see, the problem, sir, is in terms of an education, certainly for a nation such as America or any of the advanced nations, educational opportunities are pretty good, and they're pretty good now in the communist countries, though not in China at the moment. The trouble is, when you get the real rock-bottom poverty, you run into a number of problems in terms of education. First of all, the facilities really aren't there. Secondly, you can't afford to go to school. Thirdly, and most damaging of all, the whole motivational pattern of lifting yourself by the bootstraps by going to school is not part of the culture. That is, they don't see school as a relevant means of vertical mobility, of climbing the ladder. It seems beyond their reach. And if you try, all you do are made fun of by everyone around you. You are an out of it. You're not a man, for one thing. You're a sissy. You're alienated. So there's a whole culture matrix that operates interpersonally and operates psychologically at the motivational level that's terribly discouraging. Again, by the way, here, rather authoritarian regimes, and I am no champion of authoritarian regimes, rather authoritarian regimes using modern mass media communication can really do something. Often, though, the cure winds out to be as bad as the disease it's trying to cure. But here is one avenue. I keep thinking what we could do with educational TV in the underdeveloped areas, and something is being done in Africa, of course, at this time. But it's a struggle. It's a tremendous struggle. And in the meantime, the population keeps bubbling, and things go. Look, I'm afraid we've run over time. I suggest we call it officially over, but I'll stick around for those who want to stick around. Thank you.